Vince Venturella's topic of the week for November 4th, 2016 is, do I like synergistic pieces in my war games where they work together to overcome a greater challenge, or do I like single individual models that work very well on their own? The answer is yes. I'll start with some loose terminology that I used from my days playing Magic the Gathering, and I believe is still used today, which is called archetype. For those who don't know, Magic's kind of divided into the 5 colors the same way that Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer 40k is divided into its own factions. And an archetype is basically a grouping of these individual factions, either a grouping of these individual factions or the factions working alone. For Magic the Gathering, you always you had at least one color, and you usually chose a second, maybe even a third color. 4 colors was a little bit too far, and there were some 5-color decks that worked best because they were grabbing a little bit of each of the worlds. In Warhammer, this is down to usually a single army like Dark Elves or Warriors of Chaos or Empire. And that was the archetype that you played. Now, what I mean by archetype is it's kind of a loose term for both strategy that you're going to use to win the game and the number of pieces that you can actually select from to build your army. Apology in advance, I may use the term list, army list, or deck interchangeably. Basically, everything that I'm going to be talking about is how you build whatever you're going to bring and set on the table for the game. Now, there's 2 ways that you go about picking the archetype. A, you choose an engine, and that engine falls into an archetype, and then you have to build from said archetype. Or B, you pick the archetype from the beginning and then select the engine and staples from there. Engine and staples are both competitive terms, and they mean basically what Vince was trying to describe. A staple is something that works very well on its own, and it does the best on its own, although it may not work in conjunction with other things on its own from when you look at it. An engine, on the other hand, says, hey, look at me, look at this other card or model again. These are going to work very well with one another, and you want both of them, or maybe there's a third piece that goes along with it. This engine's how you're going to rev your game up and actually get moving and get your game won. Although it may be the staples that actually win the game in the long run, because they are the best at what they do. This is the basic bit of game design that I think a lot of game designers don't understand, is that if you have a lot of staples, they're going to be run individually, or it's just going to be a mess of staples that your list is going to make up, and it's going to crush the opposition, but it may not be a fun game for the Johnnies out there. An engine, on the other hand, is something that Johnny loves watching. He loves watching these pieces work. He likes watching the pistons move up and down. He likes how it interacts with, or it feeds power to the transmission, which whirs all of its gears and gets the car moving forward. That's what Johnny loves. Whereas Timmy's like, hey, here's a big guy. I want him to just smash things and keep going through it. The basic game design principle that needs to be understood is that you can't have so many engines that none of the staples are worth taking at all, that you would rather have a second engine that is just as big and bulky instead of taking a number of staples. But on the other hand, you can't have so many staples on the board that there's no engine to work off of. A good game design is a balance of both staples and engines. A great example of this is back when I played Magic in what was, I think, 2009, based on what I'm looking at. And there were 2 kind of big decks at the moment. There was what was called Jund, which was black, red, green. Basically, it was your staples deck, a lot of really good spells that worked independently, but you were laying them out every time. So every time something hit the board, it was a new threat that your opponent had to deal with. And it's kind of, I wouldn't say counter, I'm not sure if I would say counter exactly, but I would definitely call it a competitor was blue-black fairies, which used a lot of the synergistic fairy themes along with having its own staples that also just happened to have the word fairy that the tribal deck could go off of. These were two decks I would say were, one was a very good staples deck, one was a very good staples with some engine, and both of them competing against each other made for a very healthy community at the time. Going a little further into archetypes and whatnot, basically when you get an engine that is a well-built engine and a number of staples that you know are automatically included, you get what's called a skeleton. Skeleton's basically what you're going to drive into said competition. It's what your entire deck or list is built off of, and if somebody wanted to start another one of these, a similar list, and say, I'm going to be more powerful, the skeleton is something that they are automatically going to take themselves. They're not going to leave out anything in the skeleton. What you then get is a few other cards that are kind of people's choice. It's cards or pieces. I'll use those interchangeably as well. But these pieces are things that they like what they look like. They like how they act. They know how they act. They know what they're going to do with them. So it's more of a personal playing choice, and usually this comes down to maybe the last. From what I've seen in my days as a net decker or net lister, it's about a third of the deck. You have about a third of the deck dedicated to the skeleton, a third of the list dedicated to personal choice, and then the other third is what I'm calling the frame. And basically all the frame does is it gets the deck or list legal for whatever game you're going to play. For Magic the Gathering, this is usually your land or mana base. For Warhammer Fantasy, this would definitely be what you call the core tax, and Warhammer 40k, probably the same thing. Now the interesting bit is that sometimes the frame can be a part of an engine. I'll use Warmahordes as my good example of that. Because the frame, the thing you have to have on the table is a Warcaster. And that's basically your frame, and that's going to dictate what engines you might put in there and what staples you might put along to deal with the opposing faction. So talking about individual games, Warhammer, I'll start with Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition. There wasn't too much anything that said, hey, this is what this specifically does. You looked at a zombie unit when you were brand new and you didn't know what a zombie unit was for. It was basically a body. You probably shoved it forward in a block of 20 and it probably died to whatever it was fighting right away. And you kind of went, well, this is stupid. Why would I ever play with this? But if you knew that if you took it in a block of 50 and shoved it forward into something big, that something big would be stuck there for 2, hopefully 3 turns before it got out of combat and then could come after something bigger. It was a chaff unit. And nothing about Warhammer Fantasy really said, hey, this is this is a chaff unit, this is how you should use it. This is a I wasn't as big into Warhammer 8th Edition before everything turned into Age of Sigmar, but you knew, okay, Wood Elves had a lot of what you call skirmishers, where they were guys that just ran back and did nothing but shoot into combat. Dwarves and Empire both had a gun line. Each of these factions knew how they were going to work, but nothing in Warhammer Fantasy told you, hey, this is how this engine is going to work in the end. Warhammer 40k, boy, if there is a war game that doesn't better describe what happens when there's when there's next to zero synergy and nothing but staples kind of everywhere. I don't think there's a better game that describes this than Warhammer 40k. You get a lot of lists that say spam jet bikes or spam wraith knights or spam riptides or something like that. I want to say back in the old days when you had the Fish of Fury, the Fire Warriors jumping out of the Devilfish, that it may have been a bit more synergy, but it was a lot of, hey, this works really well, let's just do it again and again and again. And at least now when I look at lists, there's a lot more, let's take a bunch of staples. There isn't something in Warhammer 40K that says, kill this and your entire opponent's army blows apart, which is kind of the key the key about engines. Is there's one or two pieces that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, or they get taken out, that the whole engine kind of crumbles from that point forward. I mentioned Warmahordes, that you take everything for Warmahordes based on whatever frame you start with from the beginning. But Warmahordes has a great... I don't play the game, but it has a good number of good staples that are like, hey, you got to take this because it's the best unit, and you're taking it because it does what it does very well. And it has a few staple engines that say these two or these three work well with one another. If you asked me which ones they were, I couldn't tell you off the top of the head, so I'm not going to tell you. But for Warmahordes, you're going to take one thing that may deal with armor very well, but you're not going to take a second and third thing. Or you may take a second, but you're probably not going to take a third thing that also deals with armor very well. Same goes for high defense and a few of these other parts for Warmahordes. Age of Sigmar has a lot of good staple quote staple engines unquote as well. It's got a lot of, if I'm going to build this army, I need to be taking this guy, and they're going to buff all of these guys, so I can take a few more of these guys. The big problem with Age of Sigmar, unlike Warmahordes, is that Age of Sigmar its archetypes are either too narrow or too broad for competitive play. I'll use, for example, the Scourge Privateers, which they're basically the Black Ark Corsairs plus the Black Ark Fleet Master plus Scourge Runner Chariots and the Charybdis. When you look at the rules for the old faction, the Black Ark Corsairs and the Black Ark Fleet Master work very well together. You basically want to take 4 of the Black Ark Fleet Masters because they're worth only 40 points for a leader. I want to say, I would hope that has been edited, because I don't think it's worth 40 points, but whatever. You basically take a bunch of those guys, you take a bunch of Black Ark Corsairs, they buff off one another. That's an engine right there. However, the Scourge Privateers don't have enough models on their own to build any army greater than maybe 1,000 points. Or I wouldn't want to field I wouldn't want to be forced to field a Scourge Privateers army that was that was 2,000 points on the field. Now, because of that's the example I have of too narrow. But because of that, if I say, well, okay, let's go with, I want a bunch of Scourge Privateers, let's go with what the next step, what would also use that, is it's everything in order. And everything in order, I have so many better choices to choose from a bunch of Fleet Masters and Black Ark Corsairs. And that's what I mean by Age of Sigmar is the archetypes are either too narrow or too broad. Now, this basically wraps up everything I wanted to say about staples, engines, archetypes, skeletons. I'll include a few more items before you can turn off the video without feeling satisfactory. The first is the sideboard, and the point of the sideboard is that it's designed for whatever you're facing kind of midway through, when or it's designed to beat certain opponents that you may have trouble with otherwise. It includes things that you normally wouldn't include because you're not always going to face said opponent. But when said opponent shows up, you basically sideboard or bring these new people or new items, new character or new cards, new things in place of things that aren't quite as effective against them, and you do better against them. Kind of the final thing I have is that synergy has a lot to do with game mechanics. It has just as much to do with fluff. In fact, having a fluffy army on the table is why we play certain armies over others. And being able to include something, say a lightning bolt, in a deck that has a lot of lightning creatures, or playing something that involves pirates on the seas, you don't want to have to end up including a ninja in this. So I think I'm going to wrap this up and end this on this note. A lot of basic game design has to do with how well the game designers work with staples, how well they work with engines, how well both of them can create certain archetypes, how well both of them can create a skeleton for new players to kind of latch on to build around, how you can still add your own personal flair to the skeleton, and oftentimes it ends up being staples to a light degree or another. You should almost always have a frame to it if you are required to by your game, and having a sideboard in helps out. But almost all of it is on the game designer, how well they balance taking a bunch of staples versus taking a bunch of engines versus taking a combination of one, maybe two engines, maybe adding on, taking one engine and adding more pieces that make that engine worthwhile. It's how well they manage the staple to engine ratio. With that, I'm going to let y'all go. Have a super happy time. Get subscribed if you haven't. Stay subscribed and post a comment below. Have fun.